I think it's fine. Sorry, we needed to unmute for those online. Good evening, everyone, once again. Welcome, a very warm welcome to you this evening. Good evening to those of you who are in the room with us physically, and also those who are online from various parts of the world, and particularly from the continent of Africa. My name is Shuvai Nyoni. I'm the Executive Director of the African Leadership Center in Nairobi in Kenya, and it is my distinct honor to welcome you all today to the ALC's 2024 Peter Kofi da Costa Memorial Lecture. We have quite a number of people who had signed up for our event, and we hope that as the evening progresses, they will join us. But we also have a number of people who are joining us online. We had, I think, over 147 registrants. So hopefully we will have more people joining us as the evening progresses. I want to also welcome any of Peter's family who may be joining us online today. And we also acknowledge Peter's brother, Ambassador Alex da Costa, who we know has not been well, and our thoughts and prayers continue to be with him and with all his family. We also remember, of course, Shiru and the girls, and we know that they also are very supportive of this event that is in honor of Peter, who we also are very grateful to them for lending him to us for the time that he was with us at the ALC as a member of our Board of Trustees. Allow me to also acknowledge the members of the African Leadership Center's Board of Trustees who are with us in the room today. The board have been in London for the past few days for various activities that are linked to the beginning of the academic year, including welcoming some of our new ALC fellows, some of whom are also in the room today. We welcome you, ALC trustees. Thank you for your continued support. Today's lecture, titled The Afro-optimism of Peter da Costa and the Power Dynamics Around Knowledge, will be delivered by Dr. Dede Amanor-Wilks, a comrade, colleague, fellow sojourner of the late Peter, having interacted with him as a scholar, thinker, and disruptor, both here in the UK and also, of course, on the African continent. Dr. Amanor-Wilks, we are very appreciative that you agreed to do this and accommodated our request. Thank you so, so much, Asante Sana. We look forward to hearing you speak to us today and on a topic that we know you will share your knowledge on, but also some of the memories of Peter. This year, we hold our event physically here in London, of course, and also virtually. And hoping that as many as knew Peter and loved him will be able to join us online as well and interact with us online. So after the lecture, we will have some interaction and we will be able to hear from some of those who are online. As many of you know, this lecture is a part of legacy projects to the memory of Dr. Peter da Costa. And since the last lecture in 2022, 2 of the 3 Peter da Costa Fellows have produced a range of publications as part of their work on the project, and we look forward to releasing and sharing some of this work very soon. Let me also take a few moments to just share or outline information about today's session. It is being recorded, and also some photographs will be taken. Part of the recording will also be posted on various online platforms. So if you wish to not have your image used in any way, please do indicate that to us. And my colleague Aliyah, who's in the room, will take your name down. So please, if you do not wish your image to be used in any way, please do let us know. I will also then invite, of course, our chair for this evening, Professor Funmi Olonisakin, who will take us through the proceedings of this evening to come and join me after I have finished welcoming you all. And at the end, we will hear a final word from my colleague and sister, Professor Ikpe, who is the director here of the ALC in London at King's College London, who will give some closing remarks. But for now, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Funmi Olonisakin, who is the Vice President, International Engagement and Service here at King's, and is also the founding director of the African Leadership Center, both here at King's and in Nairobi in Kenya. So Professor Funmi, you're most welcome.
Thank you very much, Shuvai, the director of the executive director of the African Leadership Center based in Nairobi. Colleagues and For participants online, I saw the numbers rolling in earlier, but actually the last figures here were more than 200 people, and I want to really appreciate that this is Peter's network on the continent of Africa. For the first 3 years of this Peter da Costa lecture series, we were confined to the online space. And we, every year for 3 years, had this online. We had 1 year of hybrid lecture after COVID. And this is our first attempt to do that as hybrid again. And I really appreciate that colleagues are joining us in the room, but especially appreciate those colleagues who have joined us online. Without further ado, let me welcome you again to this year's Peter da Costa lecture, public lecture, to be delivered by no other than Dr. Dede Amanor-Wilks. She holds a special place in our network, but also a special place in the network of people that are friends and colleagues of late Dr. Peter da Costa. It's my pleasure to welcome you to King's and to the African Leadership Center. Not to embarrass you, there's a long and necessary CV to read, just so that when she begins to connect the dots in terms of her journey, Peter's journey, her own work, and the experiences and the engagement in relation to the continent of Africa, you understand fully who she is. Dede Amanor-Wilks, who holds a PhD, which I'll come to in a moment, is a journalist and economic historian who has worn various civil society hats, and having come full circle, currently runs her own multimedia project called Your Ghana, My Ghana, hosted by the Graphic Communications Group. Dede served as ActionAid's International Director for West and Central Africa, based in Nairobi during the 2000s, and as Director of the Interpress Service, IPS for short, Regional Center for Africa, based in Harare during the 1990s. In 2019, she joined the Institute of Economic Affairs in Ghana as the Executive Director, moving from the African Center for Economic Transformation, where she was Director of Comms and External Relations. Prior to that, she had worked with the UN Economic Commission for Africa, ECA, undertaking assignments with the African Climate Policy Center, the African Center for Gender, and the Business Development Unit. She also undertook development research projects for DANIDA, the IDRC, that's Canadian IDRC, Irish Aid, the ILO, UNDP, UNIDO, UNICEF, and the Panos Institute. She's published reports and papers on various development issues. And let me go back in time to the 1990s, where the influential role that she played in convening meant that she was able to pull people together in a groundbreaking workshop on rural telematics for 5 Southern African countries on behalf of FAO, that's the Food and Agricultural Organization, IDRC, and the SADC Center for Communication and Development. And this is really significant when you know the life history of Dede and Peter as people who started the trajectories as journalists seeking the truth, but then connecting people across disciplines and across thematic areas on the continent. In the same vein, it was in the same vein that she managed to organize a conference in Harare on labor markets for the ILO, Geneva. Her lecture this evening will say a little bit, will give you some insights into some of those areas of work. She's trained journalist herself in South Africa, in Zambia and Zimbabwe on behalf of the Nordic SADC Journalism Center in Maputo, and in Benin, Niger, and Nigeria on behalf of UNESCO's West African News Agency Development Project. She's run a series of media training workshops, but then shifting gear, in 2012, she stood as a parliamentary candidate for a small political party in the Ablekuma South constituency of Greater Accra, drawing many useful lessons about Ghana's electoral politics. A specialist in economic development, Dede Amanor-Wilks has a PhD from the University of Ghana's Institute of African Studies and an MPhil and MSc in economic history from the London School of Economics, where she taught the foundation course in economic history. She has an MA majoring in government and politics from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, and a joint honors BA in French and German from Westfield College, University of London. She also studied journalism and communication at the University of Ghana. You have seen that her career, in fact, you could like her career, her areas of study, her subjects of study straddled several intersecting disciplines. Her journalistic work has been published or broadcast by a range of media houses, including the BBC, the Independent Newspaper UK, the Africa Report, and those of you who studied in the 80s and 90s understood what Africa Report was. That is where we got some of our primary data, or a lot of data for myself, when we were looking at the Liberian Civil War, for example. At the start of that war, Africa Report played a huge role. Africa Confidential, which continues to be in existence here, and many of us still consult it. Africa Analysis, Africa Economic Digest, African Farmer, Pacific News Service, West Africa Magazine. I think Desmond Davis is in the room, who used to be the editor of the West Africa Magazine. Drum, Modern Africa, News Africa, Africa Today, Concord Magazine, Third World Women's News, the Daily Graphic in Ghana, and via the IPS, she, was, cast by numerous newspapers around the world. I will leave it there, but I wanted to draw attention to that so that you can see the influence of this year's lecturer across so many facets and the ways in which she has penetrated different, areas of work, cadres of people, and institutions. And it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you, Dr. Dede Amanor-Wilks, to give your lecture, to give your this year's Peter da Costa Memorial Lecture. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I don't need to.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the African Leadership Center and to Professor Funmi for those over-generous remarks. You said you were not going to embarrass me, but thank you very much for the warm welcome and for giving me this opportunity. It's really wonderful to be among like-minded people and great friends. So, as you know, as has already been introduced, my topic for today is the Afro-optimism of Peter da Costa and the power dynamics around knowledge. In our professional lives, Peter da Costa and I seem to be on similar trajectories, both drawn to philosophy in our undergraduate years. He through a straight route, I through my studies in French and German. We began our professional lives as journalists working in London, cut our teeth at West Africa Magazine, moved into development journalism, and then into the policy space, returning both to London to do our PhDs before launching ourselves again as agents in the world of African development. It seems we both believed we could use the knowledge gained through academic struggle to help shape Africa's development. Over a period of 27 years, we met periodically in London, Harare, Addis Ababa, Nairobi, Accra, and once in Kigali, Rwanda. When I left London for Harare to work for Interpress Service, IPS, a Rome-based development news agency, Peter was one of three London-based African journalists that I hired to help transform the IPS Africa network. Peter opened the Gambia office and subsequently replaced me as director of the Africa Regional Center in Harare when I embarked upon family life. Later, when Peter left IPS to join new ECA boss KY Amako's Inner Circle in Addis Ababa, he invited me to write their annual flagship publication, and put me on the roster of online editors. Suddenly, I was editing important economic papers. Some needed rewriting. I wasn't sure if my economics were up to the task. And in 2000, I find myself writing a proposal for a PhD in economic history at the London School of Economics. Peter wanted me to come to Addis. Give me just 3 years, he urged. I can't, I have to go and do my PhD. I enthused. The Economist magazine had published its cover story, The Hopeless Continent, in May 2000, and I was burning to interrogate their hopeless Africa thesis. But little did I know that my quest to understand the differences between Africa's peasant export and settler economies, specifically between Gold Coast Ghana and southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, would become a terrible battleground of ideas between some academic staff, not all, and me. 3 years later, Peter was himself writing a PhD on NEPAD at SOAS. NEPAD is a new partnership for African development at SOAS, and grappling with his own set of academic challenges. Today, I want to look at a few aspects of the thesis in economic history I completed at LSE while Peter was writing his on NEPAD at SOAS. In my thesis, I was looking for answers to the biggest question in economic history, which is, why isn't the whole world developed? And since it isn't developed, what is it that sparks development, and how might we apply the differing theories of economic development in Africa, to Africa? Though I submitted my thesis in 2006, already 18 years ago, I am convinced that many aspects of the analysis are, if anything, even more relevant today. I want to look at them today through Peter's lens of what he termed the power dynamics of knowledge. So let's look first at the issue of ideology. Where can we place Peter's Afro-optimism, his staunch belief that Africa could hold its own in the world of ideas, the development of science, and the practice of development? We may, for instance, ask whether there exist particular ideologies that explain what sparks development. Let's look briefly at some of the ideas of economic historians like Adam Smith, Alexander Gerschenkron, and more recently, John Iliff. While rummaging around in the LSE library circa 2000, between 2000 and 2005, one of my biggest surprises was to discover that Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, often seen as the father of liberal economics, wasn't just the author of The Wealth of Nations. He had written an earlier work called The Theory of Moral Sentiment, in which he concerns himself with values such as sympathy, virtue, and justice. By contrast, Smith's more famous 1776 work, The Wealth of Nations, is often seen as the great capitalist Bible, famous for a number of much-quoted statements. First, Adam Smith saw what he called the propensity to truck, barter, and exchange one thing for another as critical to human behavior. This propensity gave rise to the division of labor, which allowed spectacular increases in productivity. If the doors to trade were opened everywhere, prosperity would rise for all, and the motive would hardly matter. Universalism and the invisible hand would ensure that self-interested behavior brought good to all. Another of Adam Smith's most remembered quotes goes as follows: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love." Thus, neoclassical economists think of Adam Smith as an apologist for self-interested behavior, and these statements have sometimes been used to justify capitalist greed. Less rarely remembered is that in the theory of moral sentiments, Smith repeatedly places social needs above self-love. For instance, when he says, "We dare not, as self-love might suggest to us, prefer the interest of one to that of many. By doing so, we render ourselves a proper object of contempt and indignation." Or, "And hence it is that to feel much for others and little for ourselves, that to restrain our selfish and to indulge our benevolent affections constitutes the perfection of human nature, and can alone produce among mankind that harmony of sentiments and passions in which consists their whole grace and propriety." Or, No society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. It is but equity, besides, that they who feed, clothe, and lodge the whole body of the people should have such a share of the product of their own labor as to be themselves tolerably well fed, clothed, and lodged. And this one really surprised me because it seems to anticipate Marx's materialism. Adam Smith said, "Oatmeal indeed supplies the common people in Scotland with the greatest and the best part of their food, which is in general much inferior to that of their neighbours of the same rank in England. This difference, however, in the mode of their subsistence is not the cause, but the effect of the difference in their wages, though, by a strange misapprehension, I have frequently heard it represented as the cause. It is not because one man keeps a coach while his neighbour walks afoot that the one is rich and the other poor, but because the one is rich, he keeps a coach, and because the other is poor, he walks afoot." And if it appears that Adam Smith later moved to the capitalist mantra position espoused in The Wealth of Nations, surprisingly, Smith pronounced the theory of moral sentiments as a more superior of his two great works. The English political economy stimulated by Adam Smith was one of three influences from which Karl Marx drew his inspiration, the other two being German philosophy, his overthrow of Hegelian idealism, and the French Revolution of 1848. But needless to say, an appreciation of Marxist philosophy was not a requirement of the department in which I was enrolled. Still, there were interesting insights to be gleaned from other prominent economic historians, like Alexander Gerschenkron. Among modernization theorists, Gerschenkron can be singled out as a particular beacon of hope for African development. Whereas Rostow had begun his influential work, The 5 Stages of Economic Growth, which he subtitled A Non-Communist Manifesto, Gerschenkron's theory of late development begins with a re-evaluation of a Marxist generalization that the industrially more developed country presents to the less developed country a picture of the latter's future. Gerschenkron's theory of relative backwardness, a direct response to Rostow, showed that in Europe's late developing countries, the state had substituted for the missing prerequisites of development. In the first industrial revolution in Britain, these prerequisites had been created spontaneously through the investments of individual capitalists. In later industrializations, for instance, Germany, France, Italy, and Austria, the banks had stepped in. In very late developers such as Russia or Denmark, which faced different conditions, it was the state that had to step in. And Gerschenkron threw in one important proviso. In conditions of relative backwardness, the promise of greater profits was insufficient to drive industrialization, an idea broached, albeit less elegantly, also by Rostow. The risk-taking entrepreneur had to be cultivated by an ideology that promoted human progress as the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. For this reason, Gerschenkron pointed out that socialist ideology had gripped the imagination of Russian entrepreneurs years before the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. Gerschenkron argued that it was untenable to explain economic backwardness in terms of a lag in social values. And he argued to overcome stagnation in conditions of relative backwardness required more than the promise of a better allocation of resources, cheaper prices, or even higher profits. Innovating entrepreneurs needed faith in a golden age ahead. In late industrializing France, according to Gerschenkron, it was Saint-Simonian socialism, not Bonapartism or laissez-faire, that lent the spiritual flag to capitalist ideas. In conditions of Russian absolute backwardness, a yet more potent ideology was needed for the rapid industrialization of the 1890s. Thus, Gerschenkron pointed out that the orthodox Marxist concept of the iron law of historical development was embraced long before the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. We might mention too John Ilif's concept of nurture capitalism as fitting a Gershon-Cronian approach. Ilif made the point that in underdeveloped countries, development is late development, or as he puts it in his 1983 work, The Emergence of African Capitalism, African industrial capitalism is not merely capitalism, it is late capitalism. Ilif thought that three models of industrial development could be distinguished in Africa. The first was a socialist model of Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania. Ilif characterized those models as socialist because he believed that neither Nkrumah nor Nyerere had faith in the private sector. The second model was what he called the parasitic capitalism of Zaire, Zambia, Liberia, and Cote d'Ivoire. His third model, nurture capitalism, is associated with late 19th century Japan. In Africa, Ilif associated with only three countries, South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. He said an important country to watch for signs of nurture capitalism would be Zimbabwe because of its strong capitalist institutions created by a local white bourgeoisie that was anxious to find Black allies. As the use of nationalism to achieve rapid modernization, nurture capitalism may be seen as a Gershon-Cronian idea, but one of the consequences of late development in Africa noted by Ilif was that manufacturing was usually initiated by foreign firms rather than by the African state. Alice Amsden's work on the East Asian tiger economies reinforces the Gershon-Cronian idea that the state can make up for missing prerequisites and spark development in late developing economies. But she ends with a pessimistic qualification, namely that the complications of today's globalized economy make the problems of very late development almost insurmountable. So where did Peter da Costa stand in relation to development ideology? If I were to relate these theoretical concepts to Peter's Afro-optimism, I would say that one of the virtues of Peter's philosophical approach was that he was able to steer clear of the ideological battle lines and to present himself as an enabler for the passionate defense of Africa and a unifying force among the adherents of disparate development theories. From the time he moved to the ECA until his untimely passing 5 years ago, Peter was loyal to his boss, his former boss, Dr. K.Y. Amaku, who had left the World Bank in Washington to take up the position of ECA Executive Secretary in Addis Ababa from 1995 to 2005. In his 2020 book, Know the Beginning Well, An Inside Journey Through 5 Decades of African Development, KY, as he is widely known, discusses the stiff opposition he met from staff who were wedded to the alternative Africanist vision of former ECA boss Adebayo Adedeji, who had run the ECA from 1975 to 1991 and saw KY's entry as an imposition of World Bank orthodoxy. Throughout his years as an important economic advisor to KY, Peter remained loyal to his boss and committed to getting people on board for KY's new approach at the ECA. Yet the sense that KY had come to introduce a World Bank doctrine did not stop Peter from engaging with Marxist radicals whom he brought to Addis Ababa to work on make-or-break issues such as Africa's mining vision. Some of these radicals had cut their teeth at the Old Africa Center in King Street in Covent Garden, just down the road, which during the 1980s and 90s became a vibrant hub for Africa's creative voices, visiting activists from the continent and movement builders, as well as some prominent politicians. As I recall it, Peter was not regularly part of those activities then, but during the 2000s, he became a member of the Africa Center Board and supported activities that advanced the African cause. When Ghana turned 50 in March 2007, I decided to organize a symposium at SOAS to mark the occasion, and I went to see Peter to ask whether the Africa Center could support me in bringing 2 speakers from Ghana and Egypt. Within 2 days, Peter had consulted his board chair and handed me a small sum of money that made it possible to put on the symposium. Speakers included the Secretary General of the Pan-Africanist Movement, Dr. Tajuddin Abdul Rahim, and Nkrumah's literary executrix, June Milne, together with Third World Network Africa coordinator, Dr. Yao Graham from Ghana, and Alaram international editor, Gorke Gamal Nkrumah from Egypt. To our delight, every seat in the auditorium was taken. Peter believed that by bringing together people who are passionate about Africa and singularly devoted to the cause of African development, no matter the source of their ideological inspiration, it would be possible to gain some traction in moving the continent forward. The common thread was often Nkrumahism, and this made it possible to adopt a common position that while unfettered free markets were unlikely to bring about African development, a developmental state such as Nkrumah's could do so. There was also a common perception that a strongman state like Rwanda, though regularly criticized for its abuse of human rights in its pursuit of perpetrators of the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, had instilled among its people a high level of economic discipline, forward-looking confidence, and a level of support for gender equality that was rare on the African continent or indeed anywhere in the world. Now let's look at another issue that Peter began pushing for after he joined the Hewlett Foundation as their main point man in Africa. It was the need for evidence-based research. And let's keep in mind the argument he makes in the slide we saw at the beginning. It is an unequal world where science is accepted if it comes from certain parts of the world, but that everyone else, including people from where I come from, are recipients of certain types of knowledge and not really actors in actually shaping it. Now, the discipline I'm approaching this paper from, economic history, provides economic methodologies for testing history. It can therefore make historiography more rigorous, and it also gives economists more material with which to test their theoretical models. Economic history can provide a multidisciplinary understanding of economic development, combining economics, statistics, sociology, and history. But one thing I have observed is that it matters very much whether you start from your conclusion or suspend your conclusion until you've looked at all your evidence. I opted for the latter approach, but in terms of the power dynamics of knowledge, I observed that a lot can go awry in a PhD relationship if a supervisor and their student favor different approaches. Now, after LSE accepted my proposal to do MPhil PhD research on the peasant-settler dichotomy through a focus on Ghana and Zimbabwe, I did a year of coursework under the MSc to bring me up to speed with my new discipline. My supervisor generously suggested an econometric model I could use to operationalize my peasant-settler dichotomy framework of analysis. It hung on the comparison of cocoa trees as a measure of fixed capital investment in the Gold Coast, Ghana, with investment in plows as the most prevalent form of fixed capital investment used by peasants in Zimbabwe. I would be measuring the price elasticity of investment in these two forms of fixed capital. My hypothesis was that culture was not an inhibiting factor in the development of peasant agriculture in either Ghana or Zimbabwe, but the differences in the economic behavior of peasants, if demonstrated, were due to resource constraints and institutional differences arising from the differing patterns of colonization. The reason for this hypothesis was to test arguments in a controversial debate in economic history known as the problem of embeddedness. At the heart of the problem of embeddedness is a controversy over the origins of price-setting mechanisms that pitted substantivists against formalists. Representing the substantivist position, Karl Polanyi said, economic behavior was embedded in non-maximizing transactional modes such as reciprocity and redistribution. The formalist position, as laid out in Samuel Popkin's classic 1979 work, The Rational Peasant, is that rational self-interested behavior is little affected by social relations. This was wonderful. I had already gathered most of my data on which to build a model. I was able to patch together an almost complete data set for the entire 20th century. I was excited to be feeling the pulse of my new discipline. I began my experiment with a formulation of a simple equation. Y equals A plus BX plus U. We have some statisticians here who might get excited about, about this type of a case of an equation. You can see here what Y is, the dependent invariable, which is investment in fixed capital. In the case of Ghana, represented by the number of cocoa trees in a given year. In the case of Zimbabwe, represented by the total number of plows in use. X is the independent variable, real cocoa producer prices or real maize producer prices in Zimbabwe. A is the constant, B is the slope of regression, sorry, error term. Only economists are interested in those details. But disaster struck a week away from submitting my MSc dissertation. When I ran some regressions on my data, the results were the opposite of what I had expected. Instead of showing that peasant farmers were rational agents, my regression suggested that they were not rational. This left me in a state of shock. Hadn't the erudite Lipton drawn attention to Hopper's work in India, showing that peasants were maximizers because no further reallocation of resources at their disposal could lead to better outcomes? Given their factor constraints, notably in land and natural resources. Hadn't the West African Lands Committee said that Ghana's cocoa farmers had beaten all records in the world? So even if there were problems with incentives to African farmers in the settler economy model, why would the data be showing that peasants in both these distinct African countries were not responding to prices in a rational manner? How could this be happening to me? In confusion, I went to see our then head of department, a reputed econometrician who happened to be one of the leading revisionists on the Industrial Revolution. He was surprised by the complexity of my model and suggested that sometimes a simple analysis will suffice. Later, as I deepened my research through the LSE PhD program, I came to understand why a redoubtable economist, such as the Cambridge scholar Polly Hill, who lived in Ghana during my childhood, based at the University of Ghana, changed disciplines from economics to anthropology, and subsequently wrote a scathing book called Development Economics on Trial, an Anthropological Case for a Prosecution. A 1986 work. Don't throw it away, though. We can't throw it away completely. Polly Hill's work on the migrant cocoa farmers of southern Ghana is immaculate. She sidestepped the question of peasant rationality first by pointing out that Ghana's migrant cocoa farmers were not peasants, but small capitalists who moved out of their land-scarce areas in southern Ghana, banded together to form land-buying companies in the Achim forest, and waited 5 years for their cocoa trees to grow because they had an eye on the future. Her insights changed the way we view small-scale producers and of the cocoa revolution in Gold Coast, Ghana. Yet, she never achieved the accolades that were given to her mother's brother, the father of Keynesian economics, John Maynard Keynes, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics, or her father, A.V. Hill, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology. In the end, I escaped the controversies of the embeddedness debate by putting on the lenses of a new institutionalist economist led by Douglas North, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for his path-breaking work on institutions. If embeddedness was in any way applicable to the first part of my thesis, focusing on agriculture, then new institutionalism was a lot more instructive in understanding how a country moved from agriculture to manufacturing, which formed part 2 of my thesis. North defined institutions as, can anyone define institutions? What are institutions? North defined institutions as norms that govern behavior. Okay, any other suggestions? Values. Okay, any other suggestions? Rules of the game. You're getting there. No, thank you. Rules. I was surprised when I first heard this. Rules. Right, so North defined institutions as rules, the rules of the game, or the rules that structure human interaction. I think you are getting at that one, the rules that structure human interaction. Institutions could be formal, or they could be the informal rules embedded in culture, customs, and social conventions. North saw the state as the most important form of formal institution. His concept of institutions as rules and the state as the most important institution lent some coherence to the data set on agriculture that I had gathered, enabling me to reposition my thesis and to develop the manufacturing aspect of it. Leaving aside the data on prices, the two data sets I had compiled of production of cocoa, thank you, the two data sets I had compiled of production on cocoa in Gold Coast, Ghana, that's the blue line, and maize in southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, that's the pink line, provided a snapshot of the political economy of the entire 20th century. And I would like to show you what I mean by that. Or would anybody like to comment? So the blue line, the dark line, is cocoa, production of cocoa, which began in 1890, but because cocoa trees take 5 to 8 years to bear fruit, it only starts showing in 1900. So it was the 1890s, but the figure starts showing from 1900. And then because maize is a seasonal crop, because cocoa is a tree crop and grows slowly, takes several years to bear fruit, whereas maize is a seasonal crop, the fluctuations of the pink line are making this line, the cocoa line, appear less dramatic than it actually is. Would anybody like to comment before I should go ahead? All right. So this actually represents an incredible revolution. When I said that the West African Lands Committee, and this is believed to be one of the ideas that land wasn't alienated from West African farmers as it was in the settler economy. They said they had broken all records in the world. This was an amazing, if the pink wasn't there, you'd see that this is shooting up. From zero cocoa to suddenly become the world's leading producer of cocoa within a space of 15 to 20 years was just unbelievable. So, but what is interesting is drawing that period. Now, what's happening in Zimbabwe is that in southern Rhodesia, this was competition for the settler farmers. They didn't really want peasant farmers competing with them. So everything was done to stop them producing. And this is why you can see that production is very slow, very sort of level. It doesn't increase. During the interwar years, the war period, it plummets. So does cocoa. Everything's going down during the 1930s depression and the war period, the First World War and Second World War. And then, I mean, what is interesting too is that so the colonial period ends 1957 in Ghana, 1980 in Zimbabwe, right? But when I say this is a snapshot of the political economy, look what happens in 1957 in Ghana to cocoa. Can you see? Suddenly, a massive, even bigger upsurge during the Nkrumah period. And then when Nkrumah is overthrown, 1966, what happens? Massive decline. Through to the 80s revolution period, the Jerry Rawlings revolution, it then starts to increase. Only at the end of the century does it overtake, does it start to, only at the very end of the 20th century. And because I began my research in 2000, I could only get data to 1997. So I'm now trying to update these data. So at 2000 is when it reaches what it did in the Nkrumah period. And then with maize, look at this, how dramatic is that? Independence in 1980, look what happens. And so, you know, when I started my research at LSE, like almost everybody, I was very anti-Mugabe until I saw these figures and looked at the theory. And then I realized what was happening was that, you know, for everything that is said about Mugabe, what was actually happening is that we talked about, you know, the incentives and why my models weren't showing that they were rational. But what Mugabe was doing was that every year he would give peasants seed packs, seed, fertilizer. So the risks of investment in farming weren't, you know, they were cushioned. And you see that production really rises. So that's, you know, this is what I gained from, you know, from doing that exercise. You know, I was excited to be doing econometrics, but when I headed up and said, sometimes a simple model is all that's necessary. What I learned was something different. I didn't learn about the maximizing behavior, but what I learned was about the political economy, and I thought that was worth sharing with you today. So has anyone noticed in the last few months that the chocolate prices are very high at the moment? I had a lovely bar in the hotel when it was so nice. I haven't had to go and look at the prices of chocolate, but has anybody noticed? You haven't? Have you noticed? Have they been going up? A lot? Double or what? Because I know that the producer price has shot up through the roof. Cocoa prices have risen massively. And the reason for that is because production is falling in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, which together make up 60% of the world cocoa output. At some point when things were going down, Cote d'Ivoire overtook Ghana as the world's leading producer of cocoa. And one major reason is because of the rise of illegal mining, known in Ghana as galamsey. A few months ago, I decided that I needed to go back to my roots in journalism. And recently I interviewed the executive director of Cocoa Board, Dr. Joseph Wahin Edu, for my column in Ghana's daily graphic newspaper. And I also invited him onto my discussion show on Graphic Online TV, together with the General Secretary of the Ghana Workers' Agricultural Union, GAU, Edward Carraway. The original idea of interviewing these two representatives was to have a lively debate about the interventionism of state marketing boards. In my LSE research, I examined the question of state marketing boards, and this was one issue which I had no quarrel with my supervisor over. I concluded that in the case of cocoa, the marketing board was justified, which was my supervisor's position also, was justified to protect the industry from viruses such as swollen shoot disease and fungal outbreaks of black pod disease that are threatened to wipe out the industry. And it's worth noting that the marketing board was set up by the colonial government. So that's an institution that has survived into the post-independence period. Nevertheless, I was aware that not everyone shared this view and that some industry leaders believed that state intervention was unwarranted and that cocoa farmers should be paid better prices and left to make their own decisions about when to spray their farms. I expected that the GAU leader might advance an argument that cocoa farmers were being exploited by the marketing board and that we might have a lively debate. So I was surprised when both men cited illegal mining, known in Ghana as galamsey, as the single largest threat to the cocoa industry, along with climate change. The Cocoa Board Executive Secretary went as far as to say that if something is not done to stop galamsey from destroying cocoa farms, the cocoa industry will cease to exist in Ghana in the next 30 to 40 years. Some observers predict less time than that. May we have the next slide? Sorry, I should have asked you to show. Okay. So this is the effect of galamsey. You can see this is a cocoa farm. And what's happening is that the illegal miners are now going in and influential politicians are believed to be behind a lot of this activity. Although the president, when he won his first election 8 years ago, said he was going to stake his reputation on galamsey, on eliminating galamsey. It's even worse 8 years later. So you can see around these cocoa farms, around the farm areas, there are mining areas. I mean, Ghana there's gold all over the country, in many parts of the country. And what happens is that as they do galamsey around the farms, the water gets sucked out from under the cocoa trees, and then they start dying. And this is, where it's not in cocoa farms, this is what's happening. This is what is happening. And imagine, it's not only very detrimental to their health, but it's destroying the cocoa industry, which has been Ghana's golden goose since 1890. And so if Ghana's golden goose, the cocoa industry, and nearly all the country's water bodies, because it's believed today that nearly all the rivers are brown now, and it's believed that only the Volta River, which we're very lucky doesn't pass through mining areas, has an outlet to the Atlantic Ocean at the estuary. It's believed to be the only clean river left. And so if Ghana's golden goose, the cocoa industry, and nearly all the country's water bodies are headed towards destruction, this reinforces one of the key points of my 2006 LSE thesis that in late developing economies, structural change doesn't just happen. It takes a strong state to make it happen. And so my conclusion, Peter's awareness of what he called the power dynamics around knowledge was linked to his quest for evidence-based research And I've hinted today that universities are not always the nice, supportive environments we imagine them to be, because knowledge is currency, and the competition in academic departments can be as cutthroat as in any other workplace. Maybe I was spoiled in my undergraduate years at Westfield College here in the University of London because I had a brilliant and supportive mentor who instructed me in the age of Goethe while preparing me for the disquieting world of Franz Kafka. His name is Jeremy Adler. He's Professor Emeritus here at King's College now, and I understand the department he built here is consistently rated the best in the UK. But what I've also learned through my journey into economic history is that in the quest to publish something new or to contribute new material to a long-running debate, data can be manipulated, and historical data are often fragile. But even when data are robust, at the end of the day, the data cannot stand alone. They need to be interpreted, and our interpretation of the data should always face scrutiny. So to the students in this hall, I say, don't be afraid to follow your instincts and your leads, but do be prepared to be challenged on your sources, on the way you went about your archival research, and even how you came across your most illuminating pieces of evidence in archives. African researchers need to boldly interrogate and interpret our data, and be ready to defend the interests of the continent through our research. Peter's death is a huge loss because our work isn't anywhere near finished yet. The hopeless Africa narrative is changing, but there's still a lot to do as we replace it to add more substance to our analysis, to inspire the next generations, and to support them as they take up the mantle in their own way and in a way that suits the ever-changing current context. Peter was an Afro-optimist to the extent that he believed that it was possible for Africa to develop, and that by bringing the right actors together, the conditions for development to occur could be sparked. This contrasts with a gloomy or pessimistic view of African development that holds that late development can only occur where the prerequisites for industrial development are not especially lacking, which is Amsden's argument. As a journalist, Peter was solid, dedicated, committed to the cause of Africa. As a person, he was humble, modest, highly appreciative of the efforts of others while downplaying his own contribution, very sensitive to the challenges faced by his friends. Ideologically and in his praxis, Peter was a pragmatist and an enabler who drew together anyone he believed could advance the cause of African development. He liked to lead from the back. He was a quiet networker, the non-ideological thinker. He had his finger on the pulse of everything that was happening on the African continent around development, and his equanimity ensured he was always welcome in all circles. As a friend, he was the kindest, most generous soul. The kindest, most generous soul. Throughout my serial research and workplace battles over ideas, Peter was always there to cushion me when I crashed, offering me small consultancies or recommending me for jobs. And I have to say that I never failed to get a job that Peter recommended me for. I wish that everyone who dreams big for the African continent and for the developing world could have a Peter da Costa, in their professional or creative lives to help cut through the rocky paths or smooth the jagged edges of each struggle over ideas in the battleground of economic development. Thank you.
Amazing, amazing. I don't even know where to start from. There are a few economists in the room.
Oh, there are.
There are a couple of journalists in the room. And I would first open it up. Questions, comments. Oh, Clement. Thanks, Adi. This one.
I can start.
No, it's okay.
No, it's better.
People online need to
Oh, yes. Look, Prof, I think this is an amazing presentation, and I was fascinated by. Can you hear me? Yeah.
I'm not Prof, by the way. You're talking about Funmi.
No, I'm talking about you.
I'm not Prof.
Oh, yeah, well.
I just, I barely made it to be doctor. I'm not.
Well, I'm going to join the doctor's club. The, the history you gave about your relationship with Peter is quite interesting, and it's mostly about solutions and thinking beyond the box. And when you brought in the illegal mining situation in Ghana, I got even more fascinating. It got fascinating, and I mean, I have a recent publication on that illegal mining that's looking at a solution-oriented analysis, proposing some kinds of leadership models that can work. And I was wondering, with your thinking and your anthropologist / economics / governance insight, would you have some perspectives on ways forward about dealing with that? Government in the mix, communities in the mix, mining operators in the mix, but also the international community in the mix. Do you have some thoughts, like forward-looking thinking?
Yeah.
On that?
Thank you for that question. And I think that's one of the reasons I suddenly decided at the beginning of this year that I have to go back to journalism, because people have to be held accountable for their actions, and there's not enough accountability going on certainly in Ghana. And then there are exciting things happening around the continent, such as in Kenya. I'm sort of looking for things that can inspire the youth, because if the youth don't, take up the mantle, I don't know where Africa is going to end up. I'm also interested in looking at beyond. I think that people are really tired of electoral politics in many countries in Africa now, definitely in Ghana. We're becoming more and more cynical. And so I'm questioning whether this model really works for Africa. Every 8 years, we have elections every 4 years in Ghana. Every 8 years, we change the government. And we know that it's the two big parties. The other one will come because the small parties, the small parties are amenable to influencing by the big parties, and therefore they can never really have much hope of breaking through. But we know that it's 8 years, this one is going to come, and people are very cynical now about what politicians are coming to do. And the electorate is becoming cynical because they think, well, election period is Christmas. This is the time when we can also, enjoy small Blonia, it's Christmas. But the economy seems to be getting more deeply mired. Not improving. The president said he was going to deal with Galamsey, but the situation is getting worse. Nobody now can see that it's not worse. And so I've been exploring a little bit through the show I now do. So KY Amoku, Peter's former boss at the ECA, has been doing. He just retired last month, but he's put together a group of people. Representing all the different interest groups. He's trying to set up a compact to get buy-in for a development plan that every political party, everybody would buy into. There is actually supposed to be a body that does that, but the parties themselves don't make use of it, and they won't buy in. Everybody wants to bring a new manifesto, a new program, and they want to take credit for all development projects. So typically, when a new government comes in, the old development projects get abandoned. Except everybody likes roads, because that's where you can cream off a lot. Roads are very big projects, and it's easy to so the roads are never built correctly, and after the rains, they always start falling apart. But in one of my recent shows, I explored the idea in there's a festival in my mother's hometown every year, Asafatu, which celebrates old ancient battles. And it's a very big festival, actually. And I wanted to explore the idea of it's a stronghold. That area of Ghana is a stronghold. It's an NDC stronghold. But we have an interesting system, because even where you have a stronghold, if it's the government of the other party that's in power, they will appoint the district executive. And so what you have is the MP may be from one party, the district executive may be from another party, and then they don't want to work. They don't typically work together. There's tension between them. They sabotage each other. And so I actually I went to speak to the paramount chief And he sent one of his representatives for me to interview and to come on the show. So I was looking at this whole thing about, are the chiefs, it was interesting, a study in Zimbabwe, at the time I was living in Zimbabwe and through my comparative study of Ghana and Zimbabwe, a study done by Rukuni in Zimbabwe found that people in the communal areas feel much closer to their chiefs than they do to people in central government. And so I wanted to explore that with the chiefs, how do they navigate this thing of, it's this party, it's that party, how do you work with this party when the, elections change parties? Where are the chiefs? Are they used, they're close to the people. What do they do with this traditional power they have? And it led to a very interesting discussion because the chief who came to represent his paramount chief agreed that he was going to go back to the paramount chief. And in fact, he did. Before we aired the show, he said the paramount chief had given the green light for us to air it. So what we agreed was that they were going to come up with a development plan for Ata, and they are now going to, so they say, and we are going to hold them to account, are going to insist that whichever political party is in whichever position must buy into that and state and agree with the paramountcy what aspect of development they will agree to do. So, it's worth exploring, to see, it's a source of power. Can we do anything through that? Because I think that the present model is not working. How we can reform democracy to make it advance the needs of the people is not clear, but something has to change. The youth are becoming very disaffected, jobless youth. Nothing is happening to give them employment. And that can only lead to an explosion when you consider that 60% of the population are under 15, or is it under 24? But we have a very youthful population, now overtaking Asia in its youthfulness.
Thank you. We have a few questions. I'll go to Eka. Then I have Monia online. Then I have Karuti. I'll come to you. And then Joaquin. Eka.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Dede. That was really fascinating. And I think for me as well, as I find a kindred spirit in you. And I want to ask you about some of the tensions that I face as well. Those who know even a little bit about me will know that I am a huge, this is some of what you said has been a lot of what my own work has been around. How do we think in more complex ways about the role of the state in development, about the place of state capital? In the way that Professor Thandika Nkandawire actually did, I think, very compellingly when he challenges us to go back to the post-independence period and not be stuck on the 1980s as the only vision of Africa that we can have, that we have evidence. So I was very,
the 1980s as a structural adjustment,
1980s as structural
adjustment period.
Exactly. Right. So what you said about scholarship thinking of nurture capitalism and reflecting on Nigeria, for example. Let me take that as a takeoff point. I think if we look at the 1970s and 80s, of course, a lot of there's a reason why Professor Nkandawire found that evidence, because it's there. And even what you showed here, the levels, here you spoke about agriculture, but if you think of levels of manufacturing output, it has been difficult to meet those levels since. Only recently do we begin to see some return to that kind of performance.
Very little.
Yeah, exactly. Now, but what you also hinted at some of the tensions that some of us who try to challenge others to look at this. You hinted at some of the challenges. Of course, we know that one is, the stranglehold of neoliberalism in the way many of us see the world and don't even realize, this focus on methodological individualism and all of that. But putting that to one side are also the tensions in the age in which we live, where we can think of, the economic development, some of which you show, the performances in our culture that you highlighted there, but also the states that are enabling that to happen. Right? We think, you said that you think of Zimbabwe and you think of Mugabe and the tensions there.
Right.
I think many of us can look at Rwanda and some of the courage, I would argue, we think, if we reflect on state capital there. But again, the tensions when we think of the government in that, on the state in other spheres, in the political sphere. For example, tensions we see there. Even Nigeria, we celebrate in the 1960s, those were military dictatorships
Mhm.
as well. You move to Southeast Asia, or East Asia, a lot of those were also military dictatorships.
Yeah.
And so the tensions that we find, economic development is going in the direction we want to see, but how do we navigate the cost at which we think of China today? And we can talk about that, but we can also think of the Chinese Communist Party alongside that. So
Yeah.
I'm interested in how, I don't have a clear answer. How do you navigate that tension?
Yes. Take a few more.
Can you hold on, because
Sure.
there's some I think this question online would also be very relevant. But first and foremost, Max Bankole Jared,
Friend of Peter.
yes, says, excellent, Dede, no question. It was excellent and did true justice to our mutual friend and brother's work. His work, thinking, and memory. That's from Max. It's not a
Thank you,
question.
Max.
I wanted to pass that message. Max, thank you so much.
Thank you, Max.
Then there's someone who's asking a question. Thank you for the enlightening presentation. My question is on how we can strike a balance to leaders who serve the communities, like what Mugabe did with seeds, and yet do not uphold human rights. So I wanted to link. Is there not an opportunity to develop a development theory that speaks to these challenges? So I thought we'll take that at the same time.
Can you read the last part of that one again, please?
So he's talking about how we can strike a balance,
between human rights and economic rights.
leaders who serve, who serve their communities, like what Mugabe did with seeds, and yet do not uphold human rights. Is there a theory? Is there an opportunity to develop a theory that speaks to these challenges? So it's not unrelated to the tensions you're talking about. So maybe you take those two together before you go to the next one.
All right, sure. There's a concept of state autonomy that in those dictatorial, whether they're benevolent dictators or whatever, because they suspend human rights, they have more autonomy to do the kind of things that you won't be able to do when you're respecting human rights as a liberal philosophy, as a liberal paradigm, as a liberal standard, let's say, and value. Yes, and so the question you raised, and also you can, you have to kind of balance between economic rights and human rights. Sometimes it requires a balancing act. It's a very complex issue because human rights is a very broad field. And okay, let me give an example. You see, what are considered human rights in an advanced economy may not be considered the same in a less advanced economy. And yet, yet at the time that those economies, for instance, advanced European economies, things that are considered human rights violations in Africa now weren't considered so in their time. And you can point to so many examples. One example in my research that I often point to is the issue of child labor. Now, we all love children. We all feel very strongly that children should be protected. But in an economy where unemployment is very, very high, there aren't jobs. That means that means the economy has a very high dependency ratio. If you have a lot of very young people and very old people who need taking care of, and in the age group that should be working doesn't have employment, how do you take care of those kids? And that's why it doesn't surprise me to see children working. And there's one Dutch researcher who has actually argued that work that is not damaging to children's health can increase their self-esteem. And I'm all for that, because when I was 11, growing up in Warwickshire, after leaving Ghana, after Nkrumah's overthrow, I used to work at age 11. I had a newspaper round. I used to babysit for the choir mistress, and holidays would go strawberry picking, potato picking. And it gave me a lot of pride to be able to buy my own clothes from the age of 14 and not rely on my mother, who was struggling. And so I feel very sympathetic to that view. The problem is when work, for instance, something like Galamsey, you wouldn't want children working. That's very hazardous, even to adults. They say that children swim in those rivers and that they're going to get mercury poisoning in time. So it's relative. It's relative, and I think that we should understand why those things that are considered human rights violations in advanced economies may not be so in an underdeveloped economy. It's about understanding the context and why these things exist. There's something in economic history called an economizing explanation. The new institutionalists have that economizing explanation, why certain things, why certain cultures or practices prevail. And there's an economizing explanation. There'll be some reason in economics why that hasn't fallen away. So it's worth looking for that. There are certain concepts you can look for, like the economizing explanation, state autonomy. You just have to make sure that if you can wed your data, your data and your theory, make them consistent, coherent, then you can push your own concept of the way forward. Don't be afraid to think for yourself. That would be my number one recommendation.
Thank you. We'll take the next two. Professor Karoti.
I almost withdrew my question after Eka's comment because it's almost related. Because I would like to go back to your original question around which your discussion is organized. And thank you very much, Dede, for this. Also, this is a great and very fascinating. It opens new opportunities to ask new things. But going back to the question you posed at the very beginning, why is it the rest of the whole world is not developed? And what is it that sparks development? I think those remain and will continue remaining very important questions in development studies and in politics of development in general. But I think one conclusion that seems to be coming out of your work is that state matters, institutions matters. But then what kind of institution matters and what type of state matters is what we have seen with your two graphs on Zimbabwe and Ghana. Where they were not sustained, again, that gives us a reason to start digging deep.
Yes.
And even the Galams itself begins to raise quite a number of questions. What kind of state do we have in Ghana? What kind of government do we have in Ghana? Which government is that tolerating Galam's individual investments for the last 25 years without mechanization, without industrialization, and shaping it rolled out, right? What's the incentive? And the question then that I think we need to start posing is what can be done to incentivize the state to do the right thing?
Yes, absolutely.
And Kandawire fails also to do that because he says, actually, our discussions on neo-patrimonialism does not give us an answer, right? And the elite in Africa is predatory elite. So what answer do we have? And again, you show in your discussion, later on answering Clement's question, that even in Ghana, governments plan for a very short period of time. We don't have visionary thinking. They don't plan for generations. They plan for an election. And I think that's where we need to start posing new questions for students to answer.
Yes, those are very good points.
Thank you. Can we take one?
And up together, right? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Doctor. I think my question is, at the beginning, you mentioned the word climate change. Are we is the climate change narrative, is there for a lot of issues or wicked problems in Africa becoming escape mechanism from actually doing deep research to understand the context and actually uncover the issue properly? Because, the case study of the mining you show, for example, and looking at the correlation between the mining and the cocoa production, and one could argue that it's a climate change. But my concern or my question further, there's so much narrative around every major incident, crisis, issue now is just being boxed as climate change. And how can we come out of that to be able to look at the context and to be able to challenge? While I agree climate change exists, but the real issue, are we in danger of just wrapping everything to climate change without actually digging deep or interrogating the problem?
Thank you. Can I get an indication of how many other people? I know Gloriana wants to say. Okay, so we have the next two. Let's get a response to these two. Before you do that, there's Mummy online. Thanks again. I cannot overemphasize how appreciative I am for this event and the recognition of the great Peter da Costa. He believed in African growth and how all of us, no matter how small, can play a role. Thanks again. I'm just reading
Thank
to you.
you.
This is very, so you have those two questions there.
Yes, so the first one was about what kind of state. And it's true, there are many different types of state, and it's how we get the kind of state. We need a developmental state. That was one of my arguments. Because I just don't see what other options there are to spark development. So what we've learned from economic history is that it's only in the case of one country in this world that development, industrialization occurs spontaneously. That's Britain was the only country in the world, the first industrial revolution. Every other every other industrialization not everyone was state-led, but so because they were trying to catch up with England. So as Gershon had pointed out, in the later industrializers, it was the banks that took in the banks, and then only in the very backward economies, and he characterized Russia and Denmark. So in the other ones, France, Germany, all those countries, it was the banks that helped to provide the capital. But in the very late development, and I suppose backwardness means that the banks didn't have sufficient capital to finance development, the state had to do it. So in Africa, which, is now has lagged so far behind all those other countries, what are the options? If the state doesn't get involved, it has to be a very strong force. And we still don't have a very vibrant capitalist sector who can do that. We don't have many billionaires who can do that. So if the state doesn't make it its business, and then there's an interesting argument made by an Asian development economist called, it wasn't Barton, Mushtaq Khan. He's written a book on it. And he says the problem is that he's in SOAS, isn't he? In fact, I first saw him at a talk here while I was writing, and then I read afterwards some of it, and it really resonated with me, because he was saying that the problem with the World Bank model is that if the World Bank, if their structure adjustment, whatever they call it at a particular time, if the World Bank is essentially running the African economies, there's no incentive for the state to do anything. They just twiddle their thumbs, wait for the next election, And so, you need, and that's why I appreciate what KY is doing in trying to bring together the different actors to work on a development plan. You need buy-in from everyone who can make something happen. And to enforce that everybody must adhere to this plan that we've all agreed on. What is going to happen in education? What is going to happen in health? How are we going to spark industrialization? How are we going to create linkages between agriculture and manufacturing? If it's not planned for and budgeted for, it's not going to happen. And how much of that do you see in the annual budgets? There's nothing in the annual budgets that shows that we're really serious about sparking development. So until you get a nurture capitalism state or a developmental state, I think that I would see them as similar. Nurture capitalism or a developmental state. Because one thing about ILIF, we were talking about, yes, we sort of talked about ILIF earlier. Interestingly, ILIF was the one who talked about nurture capitalism and the other models but interestingly, at that time that he was writing in the 80s, ILIF said that he was trying to say that China and India hadn't succeeded. He hadn't sort of noticed that China was quietly becoming the workshop of the world. So things, new trends emerge that you never imagined 20 or 30 years ago. There's always something around the corner. So the thing is to always be ready to spot the new trends and the new opportunities, and to ride the wave when it's higher. On the other thing, climate change. So when I had the Cocoa Board executive and the trade union, the Agricultural Workers Union, they both agreed that Galamsey and one said climate change and then Galamsey, the other said Galamsey and then climate change. So in this particular case, yes, climate change maybe is becoming a panacea for many things, but the fact is that we see climate change. So maybe the bigger debate at the moment is whether Africa should be. I know there's some climate change experts in this room who can speak to this. The question of Gondi, what is the just transitions, and the thing that Fatima works on is called what? Stranded assets, yeah. Whether Africa should be allowed to strand its assets, whether Africa should be encouraged to strand its assets. Because at the moment in the climate change debate, it's believed Africans have made the claim and have won sympathy for the notion that since Africa is not the one who polluted the world, and the fact that, you know, other countries' pollution, the pollution of Western countries adversely affected Africa too. They should be allowed, African countries should be allowed to continue exploiting fossil fuels for the foreseeable future because they're not contributing much to global warming. So that's really, you know, those are really some of the big questions in the debate. I don't want to speak to that issue of whether climate change is a con. I was skeptical at first, I must admit, I was pretty skeptical, but I think we have seen enough evidence of climate change to accept that something needs to be done. Something definitely has to be done because we're reaching crisis proportions. But Galamsey is a man-made. It's the hunt for very fast profits, which is driving Galamsey so far. So.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to take all the questions, you know, the last set of questions, and I'll take them together. I think there are about 4. I have Gloriana, I have Glado, I have someone at the back. Wow, okay. So let's make it quick. I have to take 2 more rounds. Sorry, Dede. I thought I'll wrap it up. Someone online, Kafui, says, thank you for your provocative presentation on the debacle of contemporary African underdevelopment woven around economic history. Of course, Dede, with an exclamation mark, he says, in part, you center the state and its levers of socioeconomic production at the core of development, of course, backed by critical research. How would you think about leadership for collective development? We'll pack that, but
leadership for collective development.
Yes. Then someone says, I'm Valentine from Nigeria, and I really love the presentation. The policies and implementation in Africa is centralized on the policymakers, not on the citizens. How can we walk the talk? How can our leaders be held accountable properly? Interestingly, those are about leadership. One thinking conceptually, the other one in practice. But in the room, let me take a couple of...
My pen has stopped working, so I can't jot down. Thank you.
There you go. Lorena.
So actually my question, yeah, so my question is also linked to leadership. So I'm glad that I'm following it. And it's specifically about the relationship between leadership and the state. I was very struck by 2 things. 1, the example you gave with Mugabe and the seeds. And 2, when you said, quote, structural change does not happen. It needs a strong state. However, as you know, some states are extractive. Some states favor the elites, and this doesn't just happen in the global south. I mean, I think in the United Kingdom, but anyway, I digress. And in this context—
It's not a digression.
Yes, I just wanted to point out that also is true for the United Kingdom. But, you know, in this context, we're seeing an increasing amount of discontent with the status quo, specifically among the youth. We're seeing youth discontent, we're seeing youth protests. And oftentimes these youth protests bypass the state entirely. You know, they're very anti-system protests. I personally still, you know, romanticize those types of protests, but that's another thing. So I think my question to you is that kind of a mistake, or does it need to be reoriented? Does leadership and specific protest leadership, should it always be in dialogue with the state? Should it always be eyeing those formal institutional spaces in order to enact change? Thank you.
Thank you. So let me just take the rest, actually, because I think we have to close at some point, and you can just respond, you know, to any aspect of it.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Very, very brilliant presentation. Thank you. And thought-provoking. The question I want to ask is about the issue of power dynamics. When you were addressing it and you raised the issue of Mugabe and Kigali, I wanted to hear more. Were you thinking of power dynamics in terms of internal power structures or external, as in international media controlling thoughts and things like that? I wanted to hear more. That's just what I want to say.
Can you pass the mic behind you, and then I'll take
Thank you very much. Mine is also about leadership and the state, but in a different direction, just more of a journalistic inquiry than an academic one. When you talk about the state, do you think that the time has now come in Africa to just not just reconsider, reimagine the state, but completely, create something new? Because the idea of the state is a very foreign concept designed to solve foreign problems. And it's been foisted upon Africa. And the problems around Africa and the state and governance and leadership are replicated right across the 54 countries. So something clearly isn't right. It's a system that we didn't buy into, that we didn't create, that we have no agency in, yet we use to solve our problems. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. And up front to Gladys.
Well, I'm almost afraid to be the last one because my question was going to be rather, it's not
the last one.
a huge, okay, great. And I'm also asking it for my colleague who's sitting next to me and making some points which I find extremely, and which I find interesting. And I'm not an economist, so I'm going to and not an academic, but I also want to thank you, Dede, very much, particularly for, for the lecture, and also for remembering and reminding us of who Peter was as a human being. It really brought him back, for those of us who knew him personally, and thank you for that. The question comment was on the issue of the economic rationality of what I hope I'm pronouncing it right, galamsey, and as compared to cocoa. Zida sitting next to me tells me galamsey actually is derived, and I hope I'm not wrong, derived from the phrase gather them and sell.
Yeah.
So you've got something that if you are a poor Ghanaian struggling to survive, don't you have how would that equation that you had looked for the galamsey miner as compared to the cocoa farmer? Obviously the galamsey miner has the same lack of control over the price of gold, but they don't have to grow a cocoa tree for 5 years, which is then exported to be processed and value added elsewhere. So might there not be an economic rationality in that? And then just a comment, I was so fascinated by the idea of Kingsley Amoako, proposing this development of a constitution, which people then sign on to. We've been talking about this and the loss of meaning of elections as a process of political renewal, and it just sprang to my mind that might this be we had a moment, we had our constitution making moments, and perhaps now we need to be developing these new kinds of constitutions where we're actually saying this is this is what we want achieved by whichever government comes into power. So thank you for that.
Thank you. The very last question here.
Thank you very much for today. It was very, very inspiring. I just wanted to ask, what actions can we as young people take to kind of stimulate and encourage a rise in Afro-optimism in our generation and the generations to come? Because it often feels as though my generation, there's a slow decline in that passion to want to develop the continent. So what actions can we take to help that?
Great. Mudoni's iPhone I have here. That's Mudoni Wanyaki. Thanks so much, Dede.
Hi, Mudoni.
Very interesting interplay between your and Peter's professional lives, intellectual, political contributions and work, and the support he gave to you and so many others on all those fronts. I will bother the ALC for a copy to read more carefully. Thank you again. Think that was one of the best memorial lectures to date! Exclamation mark.
Wow.
You will get a copy of that. We will publish it as ALC. Panel 1, what do you think will be the role of the African youth diaspora, right? In contributing to a shift in the traditional paradigm of development. There is no one size fits all, as the Western hegemony system has made us believe. More and more, diaspora is feeling more the urge to change things. Should the resources used by Africa be endogenous, as in diaspora plus continent?
Wow, okay.
We're closing it.
Yeah.
Was somebody trying to, we are going to close after, so you have the last words, yeah.
So I'll start with the last ones because I can remember those, and then I've forgotten the two online, but you'll come and remind me, please, for me.
Yes.
So on that last question by Muthoni and what actions can we take as young people, right, to encourage more Afro-optimism? Was there another one along that line, those lines? Maybe that one there. Yes, some of the others sort of were related to this. Yes, I agree. And they're all kind of related. That problem of, the state, why are we still belaboring this model that, as you said, maybe it's not fit for purpose. It's you who said it. It's not that we didn't buy into it. We didn't create it, yet we're trying to use it to solve our problems. And what can young people do? Because everybody is becoming despondent, cynical about our politics and elections, which don't seem fit for purpose. What can we do? I take inspiration from what we used to do here when I was a young undergraduate student in our youth. The hub that was the Africa Center in King Street. That place was dynamic. We were forged at the Africa Center. Everybody in Africa would come to London. Anybody who was passing through London would come to the Africa Center. We were active there as youth. All our weekends we were there. People were coming to speak, people were coming to launch books on poetry, people of different nationalities, people from all over Africa. We even redefined Black. There was I was a young journalist then, and there was one poetry book that was launched, an anthology, and it was called Black Women's Poetry or something. But included in those Black women were one Irish woman and one Chinese. And it was like anybody who feels othered is Black, And we were sort of redefining ourselves and redefining the struggle. And every week we were in groups, we were forming bands. I was in an African dance group. People were coming and playing music from here or from Africa. We had the Calabash restaurant downstairs, an African restaurant. It was like a home. It was amazing. I wish the youth today could experience what we had then. And it was here in Covent Garden, and then they went and sold it. They've opened it again, but it will take a lot to recreate the Africa Center. I see, possibilities like that. You need to I think if we can't have a developmental state, if we think that the state is not an option, then the only other option is a movement. Has to be like I don't know how coherent the Kenya movement is, but we have to put more effort. The youth will have to put more effort into movement building because you have got the energy to do it. You've got the creativity and the ideas. Explore those ideas, get together and make things happen together. It will start small, but if it's a good idea, it will grow. And before you know it, you can turn things around. That's the only hope. I don't see much other hope. The idea of the chiefs, because we know that the chiefs have also become quite parasitic, selling off land and so forth. If they can be forced by the people under them to play their role, that would be fantastic, but it's not guaranteed because they've been put out of development for so long. They've been out of the development space for so long that I don't know how easy it will be for them to really play that role we need. But I would say that there's not going to be one model. We have to try anything we can. We have to try everything we think about or that comes our way to try and turn things around. And yes, someone was talking about youth in the diaspora. No, that was Muthoni, wasn't it? Link up across Africa and across the world. Link up with youth. Now the internet, you're all linked anyway. You're all linked. So there's so much you can do online. So many movements now have been created online. Which one? What? Economic rationality of galamsey. Yes, to some extent it is rational because cocoa farms aren't getting, now the price is high. The producer price has just been put up by a lot, by a huge amount actually. But you know, if prices are not responsive, if prices are not, don't give you an income, then yes, kids, young people are going to do something that's more lucrative. That people are selling their cocoa farms for that small galamsey money, which in the long run won't help them. But for a season, for a couple of years, it's working for them. So yes, it's a problem that there's no employment for the youth. That's a failure of government policy. And yet we're asking this, you know, state to be a developmental state. It's a massive ask. And I agree, that was your point, you know. It's a massive ask, but you know, in the case of a country like Rwanda, in some states you'll get it. But how do we get all states to buy into that? It's a dilemma right now, massive dilemma. But through the theory, I believe it's possible. I believe it's possible if, you know, maybe if there's a movement to create it, maybe a state formed by young people. Who knows? We don't know how it's going to happen, but we mustn't give up. We have to try. Yeah. Which ones have we forgotten to answer?
What I was going to suggest is because we have drinks outside, I think we do, and we will have a chance to interact. Everyone will have a chance to interact with you before I take her away. And so I would suggest that we leave it there and continue the conversation outside because we have the vote of thanks coming from Professor Ikpe, Director of the African Leadership Center based here at King's. For those who understand the African Leadership Center, we have a continental home in Nairobi, Kenya, where Shuvai Nyoni is the center's executive director. And then we have an African Leadership Center whose academic program is here at King's College London. But I wonder whether something is amiss. We and the Africa Center have to be doing something to meet this generation's needs.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But I would invite Eka.
You can.
Yes.
You have that dynamism.
Absolutely. Give us a vote of thanks. I think you have heard from people online and from people in the room what, you know, what your lecture has meant, both in terms of your interpretation of Peter's values or ideology or non-ideology, right? And what the economic history of the African continent, of the world, what it has meant and what knowledge is on this has done politically. I think Eka is going to do justice to this. I just want to say a big thank you. I'd like you to sit down for a moment whilst Eka thanks you.
But truly, I want to thank you too. I want to thank you too for giving me this opportunity, because these ideas over my thesis that I nearly had a nervous breakdown over, I've been not unsure what to do. I've been wanting to publish, but you know, sometimes you can lose confidence in your own ideas and so forth. So this has been very, very reaffirming for me too. It's been really wonderful, and I really feel already, you know, preparing for this, I really feel like, right, I'm going to publish every chapter in my thesis now. But I just want to say to the young sister who raised that question, you know, about having the boldness to explore your own ideas. It's very important if you're deciding to do a PhD. Please make sure you have a supervisor who you see. You must be like-minded, because you're going to be in a relationship for 5 years, and if you're at loggerheads, it is not going to work. You need to have an examiner you need to have a supervisor who you admire, or who will allow you to explore, who will allow you, because I thought that was what it was about, exploring knowledge. I didn't know that you're supposed to choose your, start with your conclusion. I didn't know I was going to start with my conclusion. I wanted to look at every theory and decide what fits, what works, huh? So you need to make sure, you know, you need to investigate the people, the people in your area, those whose ideas you admire, and then you'll have a very smooth experience, I'm sure.
Thank you.
So thank you. That's my vote of thank you. That's your pen, Funmi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dede. Thank you so much for that. Everyone in the room, everyone online, we are so grateful to all of you for taking your evening to spend time with us. I think you will agree it was well worth it. Yes, I definitely feel that way. I feel like we've been fed and we've been watered. Please, a round of applause again. Yeah. Oh, thank you so very much. I'm going to offer just a few comments to follow that wonderful talk and a lot of what we've heard afterwards. But before I do that, I do want to acknowledge all of those who have made this possible. So all those, where's Aliyah in the room? Thank you so much. Our director, Dr. Coming, Shuvai, Nyoni, Prof, Dr. Dede, of course, our fellows, everyone who has put their hands to, and Jockey who's online, I believe. Everyone who's put their hand, who put hands together to bring us here today. We are truly, truly grateful to all of you. And of course, all of you who are sitting here and online. I know that colleagues in Nairobi, it's actually very late for you, and all those in other spaces where it's very late. We're truly grateful for that. So I want to know that this was, I think, you know, from the exchange and interactions, it's clear that this was really a fascinating talk. And I think especially an interesting talk in these times, a point I'd made before about the world in which we move and the world in which we exist, where ideas that are saying we can think again about the interactions between states and markets and society are not very easy ideas to put forward in the spaces we live in. You know, because this is seen as old-fashioned. It's seen as it's not the time for that yet. We see what happened during COVID. It's not old-fashioned at all. You know, we see what's happened in China. We see what happens in relationships between China and other parts of the world. These are really critical. We see what's happening in the US in this moment. These are really critical conversations for us to be having. From the talk today, I think it was so valuable to see the importance of interdisciplinarity and disciplines that will pay. So we heard a lot about the foundations of interdisciplinarity in that work, but especially think of what we gained from thinking about economics and history, right? How being able to look over a time span complicates simplistic narratives about places around the world. Somehow it's in Africa that it's easy for us to be simplistic. But this has challenged us around that. I mentioned before that the work of Professor Nkandero, of course, has been very important also, this drawing upon this economic and history lens as well. And this is a huge challenge we have in terms of thinking of the African continent. How people feel it's easy to draw very simple conclusions. These are a simple people. You know, the point that was made actually about your research going in, these are rational peasants, because it's not possible to think of capitalism in a different way. Yeah, it's not possible to look at the lived experiences there and theorize from that basis. Yeah, and this work has shown us that indeed we must do that. Yeah, we must do that to understand our continent, but we must do that because it's valuable for understanding the world. There are ideas that will come out of these spaces that will inform how we understand many other parts of the world. And I think we must be bold in embarking on that as well. We can think about also what it means when we consider what progress and advancement might be. Yeah, and to complicate that. So yes, we reflected a lot on the Economist tagline, what is it, the hopeless continent. I remember that. In fact, something else I remember is Tony Blair talking about Africa. And I think he meant this in the kindest way, but referred to a whole continent as a blot on our conscience. Oh. I mean, I think pause with that and hold that for a minute. An entire continent of people as a blot on I don't know whose conscience, because not the African people's conscience as well, because there's always someone to speak for the continent. But then we've come round, right? And you think of the 2000s, where I think the Economist also had a different cover. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the praise and the celebration of Africa. But even then, you know,
Africa Rising.
Africa Rising, and you know, Afro-optimism, which of course I think for me the point is complexity. Because even there, we've been challenged. So we had very high growth rates. Mm-hmm. Ethiopia, for almost, I'm looking at Alagao there, for over 10 years, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Mm-hmm. And this, you know, across many parts of the continent. But now we come to a place where even that, we have to rethink. Mm-hmm. High growth to what end? Did it lead to socioeconomic transformation that has changed the lived realities of people in that continent, or does it look like it will? So I don't want to be simplistic as well. There are many places that have had those transitions, and you know, the lives of most people in that space did not change. But does it look like it might change? That's the question we need to ask ourselves as well. So in all spheres, complexity. Yeah, pessimism, optimism, but we need to be complex in how we think about this space. And I think we heard that today. Nothing like those graphs, and when you talked us through those graphs looking at Ghana and Zimbabwe. And I like the political economy, from looking at what is going on in maize and in cocoa. You can see what has happened in these countries across time. But not from those graphs, from what you said, we could see that. Yeah. I think also I'll come to something now that was really critical to the work, to Peter's work, and to the work we do here at the ALC. Yeah. What is the role of African peoples in thinking about these things, right? In putting forward these ideas, in projecting, and we heard this from Dr. Dede as well in her comments, in projecting some of these ideas that should shift some of these spaces. What is the role of African peoples here? This is a huge element of that, because there are different knowledges that come from different people speaking. But why is it that certain ideas rise to the top and others do not? How do we deal with some of those issues and some of those complexities? One key idea that comes to my mind, of course, is the work of Professor Adebayo Adedeji, who we heard about today, and his African Alternative to Structural Adjustment Program, which is one of the most fascinating interventions in response to what socioeconomic advancement should look like on the African continent. And I'm pretty sure there are many people here that have never heard from that. It's not because you've not been looking. It's because it's almost as though they're deliberate exercises to bury these ideas. Yeah? So what are we going to do to not just unearth and keep pushing these fascinating ideas? He was talking about nature and climate before it became fashionable, and thinking of that in interdisciplinary ways. So it's not for lack of effort. There are people working, there are people thinking, why is it that in the spaces we exist in, those ideas do not rise to the top? And then what is now our role in ensuring that they do, in making the efforts to drive that? So even though I'd said what I said about optimism, I draw from what was said by one of our speakers at the Africa Public Square in Nairobi. It really struck me that optimism is not easy, but we must make choices about that. We must make choices about the possibilities that we can platform these knowledges. We can think about things in a different way, and we can make space for those ideas. But something we heard from Dr. Dede, and in an interaction with Professor Olonisakin just towards the end, I think the last question we heard there, is about how that will happen. It will not happen on an individual basis. It will happen on the basis of community. It will happen on the basis of who we join hands with. So we've heard about interdisciplinary work, but also different communities of knowledge makers, different kinds of knowledges as well. It will not be enough for those of us guilty academics who will sit here and, pontificating with each other, right? It will have to be with those who are out there in those spaces doing a different kind of work, who will challenge us as well. So Dr. Dede, also the point I made about, you and I agree that yes, the state has a critical role to play. Many have agreed, Gershon Kwan, Mariana Mazzucato more recently, many across the world. But many people who live in those spaces with those states don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
How are we going to be in conversation with them? We heard that, how are we going to be in conversation with those people? Yeah. How are we going to have to nuance what we're saying or how we're thinking of these things because we're in conversation with those people? And I'm asking those questions because I don't have ready answers. I'm a stalwart for this. My colleagues will know I'll be the only one on one side of the argument, but we have to be, thinking about how we interact and how we create new knowledges as a result of that and new methods of doing that. And I look forward very much to continuing to do that with many of you. But Peter was so critical to those efforts. The lenses he brought into the room, the way in which he challenged many of us around that. And especially the ALC saying, right, it's fine for you to say these things, but how are you going to be in conversation with others? You have to pay as much attention to the conversations you're having as to the conversations you're having with others, and creating the spaces for those conversations is still very much a work in progress. This is very much part of that exercise, but it is so critical. We miss him so dearly. The work he did to support us in building community, the work, because of what he did, that we continue to do, really very much linked to the efforts he made. Some of the principles he put in place here at the ALC that we very much continue to draw upon, principles of fairness, think about equity, think about whose voices, think about evidence, thinking very much about evidence. We continue to hold those very, very dearly as well. So before, I launch into an even longer response, let me leave it there and just say a huge thank you to Dr. Dede, certainly, first and foremost, and everyone who has been with us. And with that, our colleagues online, we will have drinks on your behalf. We thank you so very much for being with us. Please, if we can continue the conversations, we have some refreshments out there for you. And please, we're speaking about new spaces, the Africa Center, we are here. We want to be such a space, okay? Right. So come to us. We have an open door. Come and interact with us. And let's think of what we can do to jointly expand and grow this community. Please, let's go and have drinks outside.
I'm so sorry I didn't answer your question. I'm sorry. Yeah, it was about the internal or